Imagine I said to some friend, I was in a place in Idaho that was perfectly beautiful. I mean, all beautiful. And the person heard me say that, and they said, wow, tell me about it. And I started to describe it. But as I described it, I started noting that there were some parts that weren't beautiful, some things that were kind of ugly, some things that were, not the best. And by the time I got done, I'd made qualification after qualification of what all beautiful was. By the end, the person would look at me and say, why did you call it all beautiful or perfectly beautiful? And then make all of these qualifications, these provisos, these exceptions. And that's what I'm saying is what's happened with omnipotence. Lots of really smart people have wanted to say God is omnipotent. Then they've qualified what that means. And if you qualify omnipotence, I think it dies. It's a word that shouldn't be qualified because it inherently means without qualification.
Marcus Aurelius said, "What we do in life echoes through eternity." What is your life echoing through eternity? Welcome to Echoes Through Eternity with Dr. Jeffrey Skinner. Our mission is to inspire, engage, and encourage leaders from across the globe to plant missional churches and be servant leaders. So join us and hear the stories of servant leaders reverberating lives as God echoes them through eternity. Brought to you by Missional Church Planting and Leadership Development and Dynamic Church Planting International.
Welcome into Echoes Through Eternity. I am your host, Dr. Jeffrey D. Skinner. What is God echoing through your life today? I am joined in the studio today, this second time this guest has been with us. He joined us the first season, and Dr. Oord was one of my professors, one of my favorite professors, if not the favorite professor that I had while I was getting my master's degree at Northwest Nazarene University. And I jokingly told him in the last episode, and I will just echo it again, when I was first encountered him, I thought he was the Antichrist. I really did. He just blew my world up and deconstructed and reconstructed but 12, 13 years later, I'm thankful that I encountered Dr. Oord and had him for a philosophy class. And he was asking the same questions then that he continues to ask today. And that is, what is the nature of God? We know he's love, but what does that mean? We have so many words that we use for love. I mean, I love my dog, but that's a different type of love than I have for my wife. And so we have all these different types of questions. And one of the first ones you asked in class was that if God is all controlling, then he must control the bad things that happen too, right? So he must be responsible for all the bad things that are going on in the world. And if he is not responsible, then how is that an omnipotent? How is that a controlling God? Mm-hmm. And how is that love if that God has the power to stop things from happening, but refuses to stop? How is that love? If I see my child drowning, I'm going to jump in to save my child. Yet we see, death and destruction, 9/11, shootings rampant these days, school shootings. Had one in Nashville not too long ago, and then one in Dadeville just a couple of days ago, and in Alabama, back just about 20 miles from where I used to pastor. And so you asked the question rightly, why, where is God in all this? And you addressed it some in your book, and a new book that is entitled The Death of Omnipotence and the Birth of Omnipotence, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Omnipotence or amipotence.
I said omnipotence. Yeah.
Omnipotence. All right. Yeah. So anyway, it is great to have Dr. Oord with us today, and we'll just call him Tom for the purposes of the broadcast, just because he's he's a relatable guy. That's one of the things I love about Dr. Oord. And I'm talking about it like he's not in the room here, but technically he's not in the room. He's on the screen. But regardless, he hears what I'm saying, is he's approachable. And he and I have disagreed on issues in the past and still disagree on issues, but we can always do it agreeably. And that's not someone that you can do that with today, especially on Facebook. You can say, my dog is brown, and somebody has some argument. I hate you. What's wrong with brown dogs? I didn't say it was anything wrong. But anyway, it is just good to have him, good to have someone to have a conversation. Let me just say in that spirit, look, if you guys are listening to this episode and you don't agree with him, it's okay. We're not, he doesn't hate you. We're not going to hate you. I don't hate you. I hope you don't hate him. I hope you don't hate me. These are we're just discussing here. I mean, this is God that we're talking about, right? And while Tom won't let us cheat on the mystery of God when it comes to talking about control and non-control and problem of evil and all those things, I still think he subscribes to a little bit of mystery of God. And as much as he tries to demystify, I think he recognizes that there is some elements of God that we may not yet understand this side of eternity. And I personally think, Dr. Oord, that physics and some of the things we're learning with quantum physics and things like that, with simultaneous existence of two realities and things like that, that we think are either or simultaneously existing, I think some of those things may help in our theological understanding of God.
Sure.
We don't know yet because it's not fully developed and it's a long ways from that. But anyway, it is good to have you here today, Dr. Oord, and just appreciate you giving me the time and coming on here.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Jeff. I always enjoy a conversation with you.
Appreciate that. And I've learned a lot, but still learning. And I just confess, I finished this book at 3:36 today. So
Okay.
I'm still processing.
Sure.
And I made some notes, and Siri does not always understand my accent. So some of the notes that I spoke onto Siri into my notepad going down the road, I was reading over the notes before the broadcast, and you're like, what am I saying? And who is Jack? And so anyway, I'm hoping that one of the things that our technology will do is improve Siri over the
there
coming
you go.
years.
I love it.
But so anyway, I did make some notes, so I'm still processing. So this will not be an exhaustive conversation, but I've heard some of the other interviews with Trip Fuller and some people like that, and they do a great job of interviewing you. So just, you're no stranger to controversy. You're not afraid to dive right in. Most theologians would kind of in their introduction would kind of ease into it. You jump right into the deep end just almost immediately when your declaration that, with an obituary, the death and a birth certificate of the omnipotence of God and the birth of omnipotence, right?
Yep.
And of course, it is interesting. I loved your opening sentence where it says, my God is so big, so strong, and so mighty, there's nothing he cannot do. I read that and I thought, how much of our theology are we still getting from our children's songs?
Yeah, good
and,
point.
And then we defend it like, it's gospel or something. But ultimately, what you argue right out of the gate is that we've not just misunderstand what omnipotence meant, but it's been mistranslated over the years. And that word almighty has been, was wrongly translated from the beginning and then found its way into the Greek Septuagint and then translated over the years and over again, even by founding fathers of the faith. In the Apostles' Creed, it talks about the Almighty God and things like that. So, but one of the things I told my wife last night, I texted you and I told her, you say that Shaddai, which was that word for, you explain that and then I'll respond.
All right, yeah. Well, the first
what my
time,
wife said.
if you're reading an English Bible, the first time you might see the word Almighty or God Almighty is in Genesis. And that's a translation of the Hebrew words El for God, Shaddai, and it's translated as Almighty. But the vast majority of biblical scholars say that Shaddai is really better translated as breasts.
Right,
or maybe mountains, but breasts is the predominant way. So God of breasts would be more accurate.
Yeah. And so I laughed. And so my wife asked me why I was laughing. And I said, so the God Almighty actually is the God of breast. And she's like, just shut up and leave me alone. So
I love it.
Then my daughter overheard it. She's 16. And so she came in and she said, Dad, we were singing about El Shaddai this weekend at TNT at Tribeca. And she said, so we were singing about the God of breast. And she used another term that I won't use here, but being kind of the vernacular of breast. And I'll give you a hint, Teton Mountains.
Yeah.
So anyway, and I said, yeah. And she said, that's just gross, Dad. And I said, and so I explained to her, look, honey, I said, breasts are actually nourishing. And that's where he's going with this. It's the God who nourishes, the God of Abraham. If he's going to have many children, the father of many nations, they're going to need protection. They're going to need nourishment. And we often say the closest thing to God's love is a mother's love. And
Yeah.
I said, so, why would that be foreign for us to think of, a God with breasts? Just because we talk about He, God is not male or female. And so anyway, she just rolls her eyes and
Good
walked
for her.
away and was not really interested in my theological discourse. But
Well,
you
I
know,
don't know how your wife and daughter feel about contemporary music, but I've been listening to Bono of U2's
yeah,
audiobook, and he's got a whole section on the God of breasts. And
is that
and he,
right?
and he knows the connection between Shaddai and this breasted God. So, if Bono says it, I believe it. That settles it.
Yeah. Yeah, it is unfortunate sometimes that our secular theologians know more about God
Yeah.
than some of our Christian ones, but that's a whole other conversation for a whole other time. But I will say this, that in recent years, I have been impressed with some of the ones that are coming out of seminary with a worship degree, and they really have a good, theological
Oh,
understanding
good.
of God, and some
Uh-huh.
strong theological understanding. And I know people like Brandon Hancock, who is
Yeah.
very much into music and worship, but has a very strong theological mind
Yep.
and careful in the music that he does. Rick, well, I just lost his last
Rick Lee
name, but
James.
Rick Lee James is another one,
Mm-hmm.
a contemporary artist out there, but does a lot of good theological work, even
Yeah.
in the context of his music there. So yeah, so the God of breast, the God of nourishment there, and as opposed to this Almighty God who is all controlling. Explain to us now how it got mistranslated. Why did the Septuagint translate it as Almighty, as controlling, like
Yeah.
omnipotent? Why did they do it that
So
way?
there was actually two Hebrew words that ended up being translated by the Greeks. One is Shaddai, which means breast. Another one is Sabaoth, which means a council or an army, or oftentimes rightly translated Lord of hosts. And the Sabaoth and Shaddai, when it was translated into Greek in this Septuagint in the third and fourth centuries BCE, they used the word pantocrator. Pan meaning all, and tocrator, or panto meaning all, crater meaning holding. And so Lord of hosts and God of breasts began to be talked about as all holding God. That word then appears 10 times in the New Testament, 9 of them in the book of Revelation, one by the Apostle Paul. It's not clear in most of those cases what it means, but they're drawing from a mistranslation of the Old Testament. And then in the fourth century, Jerome comes along and really screws things up because he he takes pantocrator, which is again very rarely used in the Bible, translates it with the Latin in the Vulgate as omnipotent or omnipotence, and that shows up in
Gotcha.
the creeds. And yep, there's the story.
Yeah. So all this time when Handel's Messiah, as we sing it to the top of our lungs at Christmas time, and
Yeah,
we've got it all wrong. Handel
yeah,
had it wrong. Bless his heart. He didn't know any better. He was just listening to people he thought was smarter than him. So,
yeah, yeah. Well, let me
but
see if I can say it really succinctly for
yeah.
your listeners or watchers. Every time you read in the Bible, the English Bible, every time you find the word Almighty, that's based on a mistranslation. I'm
Hmm.
not saying God's a wimp. I'm not saying God
Right.
can't do anything, but every time the word Almighty shows up, it's based on a mistranslation.
Good. So that's pretty much the first chapter. You walk through the entire first chapter of how we mistranslated it, and Sabaoth you talked about, and how it got mistranslated over the years. Of course, we're heavily influenced by the Greek, and you talk about
Mhm.
that, and even the Old Testament. I've heard Dr. Tim Green from Tribeca, professor of Old Testament technology, says there's some discussion that the El gods were not even a reference to Yahweh, that
Yeah.
they were a reference to the Canaanite gods or the local gods in that particular area, because the one unique characteristic of Yahweh is that he was a God of all, right? That he was God
Hmm.
of everybody, not just a regional or a local God, which was the understanding of who God was prior to the onset of Yahwehism there. So in the second chapter, then you begin to basically create your argument for okay, well, if God is not all powerful, if God is not almighty, then what is God? What is a better translation there? You talk about breath and things like that. So if God can't do absolutely anything, how is it that anything gets done, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So talk to us to unpack chapter 2 without rewriting it.
Yeah.
Obviously, unpack chapter 2 for us there.
Well, I lead out in chapter 2 with a question that was asked me as a philosophy student, a question that's actually discussed seriously by professional theologians or philosophers, and that is the question: can God make a rock so big that even God can't lift it?
Right.
Now, if you say that God can do that, then there's something that God can't do, which is lift the rock. But if you say that God can't make that kind of rock, well, there's another thing God can't do. Can't God make the
Right.
rock? And I used that to launch into a discussion of what both liberal and conservative thinkers have been talking about for ages and ages and ages. And that is, there are some things that God can't do, either because they're illogical. God can't make a married bachelor, or God can't make a round square. They go against mathematics or geometry. God can't make 1 + 1 = 397. Or a lot of them, again, both conservative and liberal thinkers have admitted that God can't do some things because to do them would go against the God's nature. So, for instance, God can't stop existing. God can't say, it's been a good run, but tomorrow afternoon, I'm out. No, God exists necessarily. And if God
Right.
is omnipresent, God can't be absent from Las Vegas this weekend. God's going to be everywhere. And so when you
Right.
start thinking through these things, you all of a sudden realize there's actually a lot of limitations, or at least qualifications, that we want to make when we talk about God's power. And the title of this chapter is Omnipotence Dies the Death of 1,000
Thousands.
Qualifications.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So you talk about essentially when you begin to qualify anything about omnipotence or any characteristics of God, then you've simultaneously limited the discussion on and the characteristic of that particular thing for which you qualify. And so you walk through several examples of contradictory. God cannot make a mountain so high that God cannot climb it. God cannot make a creature so small that God cannot find it. I love some of your illustrations here. God can't make a river so wide that God cannot cross it. So those are all qualifications. God can't make 2 + 2 = 1, or 5 + 5 = 7. Yeah.
Yep,
So
yep.
there are some absolute facts in life that God can't contradict because they're just, as you said, illogical there. So if God cannot deny God's nature, then obviously we begin to agree that there are, like you said, there are limitations about God there. And so,
Yep.
there's some differentiation. I can't talk today. Differentiations between different theologians. They'll make, where God, they're going to make qualifications about God,
Sure.
but everybody makes some type of qualification about God. And so everybody agrees there are limits to God's omnipotence there.
That's right.
And so your chapter is aptly named Death of 1,000 Qualifications, because when you make one qualification, what other qualifications are you going to stop?
Right.
Where do you
Yeah.
stop in
Imagine
there?
at the end, I try to draw an analogy. I'm
Mhm.
coming to you from Idaho today, and Idaho's a beautiful state, at least parts of it. Imagine I said to some friend, I was in a place in Idaho that was perfectly beautiful. I mean, all beautiful. And the person heard me say that, and they said, "Wow, tell me about it." And I started to describe it. But as I described it, I started noting that there were some parts that weren't beautiful, some things that were kind of ugly, some things that were, not the best. And by the time I got done, I'd made qualification after qualification of what all beautiful was. By the end, the person would look at me and say, "Why did you call it all beautiful or perfectly beautiful?" And then make all of these qualifications, these provisos, these exceptions. And that's what I'm saying is what's happened with omnipotence. Lots of really smart people have wanted to say God is omnipotent. Then they've qualified what that means. And if you qualify omnipotence, I think it dies. It's a word that
Right.
shouldn't be qualified because it inherently means without qualification.
Right. Right. That's good. So then that leads us to that God cannot both exert all power and simultaneously relate to his creatures.
Yeah.
And so if God, and that goes back to where you're creating this, what I believe is kind of a systematic theology around the problem of evil there.
Are you feeling like you're not living up to your full potential? You know you have a God-given message, but you're not sure how to bring it to life?
Made for More's Message Launch Program is here to help you clarify that God-given message, know how it serves others, and successfully publish your ministry book or digital product.
With our program, you can launch or grow your ministry, get people interested in hearing your message, and start generating more financial support.
So if you're ready to take the first step towards fulfilling your calling, watch our free training at workshop.messagelaunchprogram.com.
Join the Message Launch Program today
at workshop.messagelaunchprogram.com.
What then does it mean for God to exert God's power?
Right.
What? And so your answer to that is love. That is influence.
That's right. Yeah.
And so talk to us a little bit.
Well, here I'm going to say some things that people in the Church of the Nazarene or the Wesleyan tradition are going to say, yeah, that of course, that's right. That's what we think. We have free will. God doesn't control everything. We're in a relationship with God. We have an effect on what God does. We have some agency or some autonomy in the sense that God doesn't control us entirely. We're not puppets. All that kind of stuff is what a Wesleyan wants to say. But what I want to then add is to say that we should also think that God's love is uncontrolling, that this freedom and agency that we have is something that God gives us because it's who God is, it's God's very nature.
Good. Yeah. So if God's very nature is uncontrolling,
Yeah.
but simultaneously it's love, then where does, I guess the question becomes, where does, are we 100% responsible then for what happens in humanity? Is
Yeah.
humanity then 100% in control? You say God is not a wimp. And I joked earlier that, uncontrolling love guarantees that everybody will go to heaven, because to think that humanity's in 100% control scares the heck out of everybody, right?
Yeah. Well, I do think that once people hear the criticism that God
Right.
is not omnipotent,
Right.
that God's not in control, a lot of people think, well, the only alternative to omnipotence is impotence, a God who does nothing, a God who either sits on Mars eating popcorn, watching us from a distance, or maybe a God who's here present with us, but just not active, kind of like the glue of the universe who doesn't really respond or anything, like the Force in Star Wars or something. And I want to say, no, there is a middle ground between omnipotence and impotence. And that's where my new word comes in, amipotence. AMI, ami means love, potence means power, the power of love. In fact, the power of uncontrolling love. So I actually think God is strong. God is the mightiest. God is supreme, or I like the word I use in this book is God has maximal power. But God can have maximal power and yet be unable to control anyone or anything. That's the power of love.
Yeah, good. And so you point out the different type, but chapter 3 is evil ends omnipotence. So essentially, if God is love, and John says he is, and if God is all controlling and bad things are happening, then when the bad things happen, that ends omnipotence.
Yeah.
And so that's where omnipotence comes into play there.
In that chapter, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
In that chapter, I kind of do some new things and some old things. As you know from our last conversations, I've been working at this problem of evil stuff for a while, and I've got some proposals on the table. And those proposals come out in this chapter, but there's some new things that come out here as well. And one of them is I make a claim that's going to make some people really uncomfortable. It's the claim that if you really think God is omnipotent, then you think God has the power to install or take down any leader, any political leader in the world. So if you think God is omnipotent and God doesn't, I don't know, remove Putin, then you
Right.
must have to believe that God wants Putin to be there. At least God wants Putin
Yeah.
more than some alternative. And that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. I
Yeah.
think, therefore, for political reasons, even, we should stop saying God is omnipotent.
Yeah. And you talk about that a little bit, how even those in the who would not support Christian nationalism, for example,
Yeah.
would simultaneously still espouse that God is omnipotent, would get heartburn with the idea that God is not
Yeah.
omnipotent. And so you make an argument for that omnipotence basically leads to a dictator type figure like a Hitler or Putin, or name your dictator throughout history there. That omnipotence basically leads to that because people crave power. And once they achieve power, then they're going to model it after the deity they worship, and the deity they worship is an all-controlling God, right?
Yeah, there's two arguments there. One is people will imitate what they think is God, divine, whatever. And so, yep, if you think God is all controlling or at least can control, then if you're if you're a top dog in some country or some organization or whatever, you're going to say, well, I guess control is fine to do because God does it. And that's going to be a bad thing. But
Yeah,
my second argument is if you think God is omnipotent, then you think God has the kind of power to overthrow any dictator, any person who's a crappy leader. And if they're not overthrown, and God's a God of love, then you must have to believe that God wants them to be in that position, wants them to be oppressive. And that
yeah,
then really goes against our deep intuitions.
yeah. And so then, you know, when it comes to politics and theology, I have to keep the two completely separate. And I know that is not a good thing, but I can't find a resolution there because on the one hand, I don't see a political leader that doesn't crave power,
Right.
And so I don't care if they're conservative, liberal. I mean, I guess you could say my politics are the old type of liberal, which is more libertarian than it is liberal
Oh,
there,
yeah,
right? The
yeah.
classic version of liberal, and which is where that word originally comes from. Talk about how words change meaning. But
Yeah, that's
so
actually one thing. I don't consider myself a libertarian, but that's one aspect of libertarian thought I appreciate. I think
yeah,
libertarians do want to make sure that we preserve a place for individual autonomy. We
right.
don't want a government that controls us. And I'm on board with that when it comes to
Yeah.
libertarian thought.
Yeah, as one who doesn't like to be controlled, I'm 100% in agreement.
Yeah.
And that's why I don't mind the uncontrolling God. I just, as I said, I appreciate. I feel like you filled in a missing piece for me with this book
Good.
because I didn't know where to go because I have had some trauma in my own life, some bad experiences. Everybody's had bad experiences, and so you do question, why. Where
Yeah.
was God? Why? And even the idea, I mean, I've heard theologians say, there was a Catholic theologian a while back, and I can't remember his name, but essentially he's reading from Job, and he talks about how there's a section within inside of Job where there's this discourse between God and Job, and we have classically attributed the entire discourse to Job. And he says, if you look carefully, God takes over the conversation. And
Mm.
when God takes over the conversation, Job is demanding that God be a better God.
Hmm.
And then God basically takes over the conversation and says, yeah, I agree. And he climbs on the ash heap with Job,
Mm.
and essentially that being a metaphor for the cross,
Mm.
and is crucified there. And I thought, well, I don't necessarily want a God just to die alongside of me. That what good does that do me?
Yeah.
Okay, you feel for me. I appreciate that. But a God worth worshiping to me at least has some influence,
Yep.
over my predicament there. And
Yeah.
so I do have a question though, because ultimately you come to that it's creaturely free will that drives, and even at a you don't use cellular level. I can't remember the word that you use in there, but simpler creatures, I think is what
Sure. Yep.
simpler organisms, I believe is the way you refer to it there. So you don't believe, and you make a comment that the death of omnipotence necessarily requires us to divorce ourselves from ex nihilo, right?
Mm,
From the idea that God created the universe out of nothing.
mm,
So if and I can agree, there's not a young Earth theory. I'm not a young Earth theorist and all that, but
yeah.
simultaneously, where did the fabric of the universe come from, though?
Hmm.
If God didn't create it, is a question that comes up to
That's a
me.
great question. Well, I do think God created. However, I think God's creating is everlasting. In other words, it never had a beginning. Just like
Okay.
God's own life never had a beginning, God's creating never had a beginning.
Okay.
And so everything that exists because God created it, but God always creates in relation to or out of what God created previously, and there was no absolute beginning. It's kind of a
Okay.
mind blowing view, but it's about as mind blowing as saying God had no beginning. And if you're
Right.
on board with that, then you shouldn't have any, at least rational or logical problems
Right.
with saying the series of creations had no beginning.
Okay. So the universe, God created the universe not out of nothing, because God had already created.
Yes.
And since there was no beginning, that's why it's not out of nothing, because God, just as God never has a beginning. It was like God just, came into existence one day. That would make sense. Okay. I had
Yeah.
to kind of process that out loud. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
so,
Yep.
so that's good. So we don't have a God that endorses politics, and that's really good, because I don't want a God that endorses politics.
Yeah.
But simultaneously, I still don't have an answer for my politics, other than just wait for you know God's kingdom to finally be realized here on earth, I guess, is our hope there,
Yeah. Can I
and
make a little jab at
yeah,
my liberal political friends
yeah,
here? One of the things I say in the book, I get, really specific. I talk about how I have a lot of liberal friends who mock and make fun of evangelicals for thinking that God put Donald Trump in the White House.
oh yeah,
And it's Donald Trump is God's man and all that sort of stuff.
yeah. I hope
Uh,
not, but
yeah, but I
but I hope he
say,
didn't put Biden there either. Just to
yeah,
say,
there you go. Yeah, yeah. But I say to those people, look, if you're going to mock and make fun of evangelicals for saying God put Trump in the White House, but continue to embrace omnipotence, well, then you're
yeah,
undercutting your own arguments,
yeah,
because if you don't think God put Trump in the White House, then you should stop thinking God is omnipotent.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I saw that and I thought, wow, I'm surprised that came out of Tom's mouth. But that is, I think, just something I just get frustrated about over and over again
Yeah,
is look, I am humble enough and to know that I don't know everything. God help us if I am the be all and end all of knowledge, right? Because that is a really dumb universe. But I'm
uh,
not saying I'm dumb. I'm just saying if I'm the be all and end all of knowledge, that's
right.
pretty limited, right?
Yep.
But sometimes when we get into that political discourse, it's like, okay, you're criticizing the one side, but you're completely blind to your own here.
Right.
Just
Right.
because, look, I don't support racism any more than the next guy, but we don't advocate for abortion and transgenderism and completely miss the other side. That we're not going to control. I guess I would say we don't want to control on the liberal side and progressive side any more than we're going to control for the conservative side either.
Right.
We
Right.
have
Yep.
to all rely on God. So let's get to the very end there. You have a 6-prong approach to solving the problem of evil there. And so walk through those 6 pieces there. I guess you have them all memorized. Or I've got them here if you don't. But
All right. Yeah, I might have to rely on you. Well, the
okay,
first one is what in traditional thought is called the free will defense.
okay,
And it's one that I first started thinking was the best way to go when I was younger. And that is the idea that we have free will and God doesn't do evil, but free will creatures do. And I think there's some truth to that, but it doesn't go quite far enough. It doesn't go far enough because most people who think this also think God can take away our free will from time to time, or at least override it occasionally. But if you think that, then you got problems, because then why doesn't God do that to prevent evil? And secondly, the typical free will defense doesn't account for what we usually call natural evil, like the pandemic or hurricanes or
Right.
things like that. And I say what we ought to do is kind of extend this notion of free will down to the smallest levels. I'm not saying quarks have the same kind of free will as you and I do, but I'm saying there's some indeterminacy or agency throughout all of creation, and God can't even control at those levels, not because God's a wimp, but because God even loves the quarks. So that's the first one. God can't, because creatures are free and the world is, indeterminate, has agency. Second one, I addressed the questions of God suffering with us, which you kind of touched on a moment ago. I do think God suffers with us, unlike Augustine and lots of other people.
Right.
I think that's important to say that God feels the pain that we feel and suffers with us. But some people stop there. And I think we also have to make sure we say God is not omnipotent, because we don't want a God, at least I don't want a God, who suffers with me but could have fixed it. So that's the second move. Third
Yeah.
move is to say God works to heal. God really does want us to be well. God really does seek us to overcome those things that have harmed us. But God can't heal us unilaterally, single handedly. There has to be some kind of cooperation at some level, or if we're talking about inanimate existence, the conditions of creation have to be
Right.
conducive to that healing. Number four is that God works with us to squeeze whatever good can be squeezed from the bad God didn't want in the first place.
No, squeezing sounds kind of controlling, though, right?
Yeah, maybe it's not a good metaphor.
I'm kidding.
Yeah.
So
So,
God squeeze good from humanity,
yeah,
from bad.
yeah, at least it's working. And I don't think God can do it unilaterally again. I think
Right.
we have to work with God to try to bring something good from the bad that God didn't want in the first place. No, the fifth one says that we have a real role to play in the overcoming of evil and the promoting of good. And here I criticize a famous contemporary theologian named Stanley Hauerwas, he says, look, we shouldn't be worried about trying to solve the problem of evil. We should just be out there making the world a better place, or, developing virtuous people, etc. And I say, yeah, we should try to make the world a better place and become virtuous people and develop communities, etc. But we also need to give up on omnipotence, because if we think God is omnipotent and allowed whatever we're facing, then we're right to think that it must be God's will. And if we're
Right.
trying to overcome it, then we're actually working against God, at least potentially. And then the final one is the one that you mentioned about creation out of nothing. I think we ought to
Right.
get rid of that idea. It's not in the Bible, and it sets God up to have a notion of power that makes God responsible for failing to prevent evil.
Good. I like that. So you mentioned a few other reasons in there. If God exists but is not omnipotent, we don't need to believe God installs or supports all political leaders and policies. Then that's a good thing. So
Yes.
there's some good things that come out of that. We solve a lot of problems when we solve the problem of evil. And I will say this: as much as you are academic in your approach, you do make a good attempt in several. God can't is a more layman's approach to the uncontrolling love.
Mm-hmm.
So you do have some more layman oriented work out there. But
Thanks.
as much as it is a systematic theology, I feel like you're developing, I think it's also very much based in evangelism, because
Good.
this was born out of your desire to see other people know God, know the God that
Right.
you believe in, know the God of love.
Yes.
And the problem of evil has been, uh, as I read this, I thought, you know what? If Nietzsche had Tom Oord as a professor, he may have never declared that God was dead, right?
I love it. Yeah. That's a great line. We need to put that on Twitter, Jeff. That's a great line.
so anyway, we ever invent the time machine, we'll put your books back in a time machine and take them to him. And who knows, deconstruction may never exist, and
Yeah.
postmodernism may never come to be if Nietzsche, is converted to being a true Christian. So
Well,
anyway,
let me make a quick
go ahead.
comment on it if you don't mind. I like that
Yeah.
you see that this is a kind of evangelism. Now, most people who hear the word evangelism, they're probably going to think, well, that's trying to convert those who don't believe in God or aren't Christian. And there's maybe some truth to that. But it's also really important to me to talk to people who do believe in God, but have these huge questions. And they're confused and they're like, okay, this doesn't make any sense to me. So part of my, I don't know if evangelism is the right word, but part of my goal is to say to those who do think there is a God, there's a better way to think about God than maybe you've ever been told.
Right. And that's good news. And ultimately,
Yes.
isn't evangelism about trumpeting, bad word, but spreading
Yeah.
spreading the good news there of the gospel. And at least from your perspective, if God is omnipotent and can prevent evil but does not, that's not very good news.
No,
And so
no.
you have a theology that you've developed in omnipotence, or I don't know why I can't say that word,
Well,
but
it's hard to say. So yeah.
omnipotence. But
Yeah.
anyway, you have a theology there that helps people who've experienced, the father whose child drowned in the pool or
Mhm.
the ocean. And the pastor said, well, all things work together for those who love Jesus. And,
Mhm.
we can't really describe why it happened. We don't really know. I mean, I had a really good friend of mine. Beautiful young lady. She was, fresh out of college, incredible poet. She got a rare cancer. And I mean, the doctors were just flummoxed. They're like, we never see, not only was it rare, like 0.5% of the population gets it, but even those who do get it are generally, lifelong smokers, lifelong tobacco users, and 85, 86 years old, and something else ends up killing them.
Yeah.
And so she got this, and then they went aggressive with the chemotherapy. They went aggressive with the surgery and all, and she was making a great recovery. And then went back for a checkup like a year later, and it just exploded, and she died just
Oh,
a few months later, in her
oh,
30s. And I'm good friends with that father. I hope he's not listening. Good friends with that father, and I hear him try to grapple with, I don't
yep,
understand
yep.
why did this happen. I don't dare, when someone's in the grief like that, I don't feel like that's proper to try and come in and explain these things, because the reality is while we want answers,
Mm,
even getting an answer doesn't necessarily make us feel better in the moment. She's still passed, right? She's still
yeah,
no longer here.
yeah,
And it still doesn't make sense to know that, the only thing that may bring some salve to the wound is the fact that just God couldn't have done anything. It's just,
yeah.
there
And
just
that's
was
the
not
kind of
enough willingness and cooperation within her body to help.
right. Yep. And that's the kind of thing I think is good news, but probably not what you want to say in the midst of the deep
Right.
suffering. And what you
Exactly.
need to do is have a podcast and call it Echoes from Eternity and put that conversation out there so people can hear it
Right.
before they go into that thing. Yeah,
That's
serious.
it. That's exactly
Yeah.
right. Yeah. And I hope they do. But
Whoops.
anyway, there was one last question. Let's see if I can find that
Okay.
question I had here. Oh, I know what the question was. So you don't believe in omniscience either, right? So God does
Mm,
not know everything, and God is not powerful. Is
well, it
not all
depends.
powerful.
It depends on how you define omniscience.
Okay.
I think God knows everything that's knowable,
Okay.
but the future is a realm of possibilities, and God can't know with certainty who's going to be the next president of the United States, for instance, because that vote hasn't happened yet. So I can say God is omniscient, all knowing. It's just that the category of things that God can know is different for me than it would be for someone who thinks that God's outside of time and does know who's going to be the president of the
Right.
United States.
And so you just define omniscience differently. But
Yes.
God is omnipresent. You do believe that God is
Yes,
omnipresent.
I
Okay.
do. Yep,
So
present to all
um,
creation.
now you did mention that God is kind of non-corporeal spirit, but then simultaneously, that is he the only spirit then that exists? Because we don't really believe in a disembodied soul from the body. The Hebrew word for soul is human there and are translated in that way.
Yeah. I'm
So
open to
what is
other,
that?
yeah, I'm open to other spirits. I'm open to angels and
Okay.
demons.
Okay.
I don't think
Okay.
any of them are omnipresent. I don't
Right.
think any of them know everything knowable, that sort of thing.
Right.
But I'm okay with, human minds, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Those might be, and some people think of minds and spirits as the same. So,
Right.
yeah, I do think God is unique in some ways, but similar to creatures in others.
Okay. All right. Good. Yeah, those they're kind of off topic, but I'm just trying to help people understand.
Yeah.
You're speaking not necessarily in generalities, but very specific narrow lanes of theology of just trying to solve that problem of evil. And I do think it is very much good news for especially those who've gone through great suffering. I
Yeah.
know a lady, and her name escapes me at the moment, but she wrote a book, Trauma in the Pews. And
Janine
she
McConaughey.
okay. And so she made a comment. I want to get her on the podcast, but she said that she's exhausted right now, so she has to rest up. But
Yeah.
she evidently underwent. I don't know her story, but she said that your book, your theology, enabled her to write that book because it allowed healing in her own life.
Yeah.
Whereas she just had that question of where was God? Why did God not stop this from happening? And I don't know the nature of her abuse or anything like that. So for those who may disagree, I say let's look for the good that God squeezes out of this, right?
Yeah, there
And
you go.
and I'm not smart enough to know every possibility. I know one thing that was super impressed me about the entire thing is the book's about 180 pages long, and probably half of that is references. So, so you put in notes for everything. So if anybody wants to pick up the book, and I suggest they do, everything that you mentioned there, you give reference for, they can go back and do their own. And it's not just referencing yourself. You do some of that because you quote your own work in there. But, for example, when Augustine, when you talk about Augustine, you reference his stuff. When you talk about the mistranslation of Shaddai and meaning the God of breast, those are you take us back and you show those examples and those references in there. So I was talking with a pastor friend, and I just because I like to needle people sometimes, I just took that quote and just sent it to him, just to see what his reaction would be.
Yeah.
And like, I'm assuming that Oord has references for all this stuff.
I love it.
I said, oh, he does. Believe me. I said, if the chapter's 10 pages, he probably has 10 pages of references to go along with it. So very good, very well researched book. I really very much enjoyed it. It just released on Amazon. It's top seller in many of the different categories there. Congratulations on that. I did not know how hard it was to get a book in the best-selling category until I became an author. And I was like number 5,222 on the bestseller list. So I'd say I'm number 5,220, and now I'm like 20,000. So I was not impressed by 5,000, but now that it's been out for a while, I'm at 20,000. I'm more impressed by 5,000. So, but you're not 5,000. You're like number 3, number 2, number one in some categories there. So congratulations on that.
Thank you, Jeff. And thanks for the interview.
I appreciate you being with us. And there's other folks out there that can do, more in depth, and I'll allow them to do that stuff because,
this was a great conversation.
And I may have you come back sometime too, because like I said, I'm still processing a lot of this stuff. I wanted to get you on because the book is new. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to help you get it promoted as much as possible because you kind of strike when the iron is hot. But we may have you back again as I process some of this stuff, go back and reread where I'm not distracted and driving down the road and things like that. I had to listen to it.
Let me say to the folks who are listening or watching that, if you're a person who likes to listen to audiobooks, the audiobook version just became available. Probably Jeff didn't know about that. So you don't have to read and drive at the same time. You can listen and drive.
There you go. Yeah. Well, I listened. I just had Siri read it to me, or not Siri, but Alexa. I've got so many women in my life that read to me, I can't keep up with them.
That's great.
But anyway, it was good, but she mispronounced a lot of those theological words. I'm like,
I bet.
I don't know what that word was. I'd have to pull up the Kindle right quick at a stoplight to read what she was doing. Anyway, a lot of fun, Tom. Appreciate you, brother.
I appreciate
and
you,
you have
Jeff.
a great day. All right.
All right. Thanks.
Bye-bye. I want to remind everyone, too, that Revitalize to Plant, Reshaping the Established Church to Plant Churches is available at on Amazon or anywhere, Whiffenstock, anywhere you want to buy books, Books A Million, or you can go to book.revitalizetoplant.com. And there you can get a discount on for $15. I think it lists for $19 on Amazon. But I'll even pay the shipping through the USPS, United States Postal Service. I'll pay the shipping if you want to purchase it directly from me. Again, that's $15. It doesn't matter either way. But revitalizetoplant.com. And you all, it's been great being here. I appreciate it. Like and subscribe, if you will. A lot of people listen to this. We get about 2,000 downloads per episode. We're in the top 17% of all podcasts, which is great. This is just a testimony to people wanting to hear the story of God, and all that is good. But I'd encourage you to subscribe and then share it with your friends, because the subscriber base is what will help us get these voices out there, right? I've told you this is not about me. It cost me money to produce this podcast. I paid over $1,000 last year just in podcast promotion, production, and the tools to edit. The hosting of the podcast is not free. All these things, I'd encourage you to please like and subscribe, if you will. Thanks a lot. You can be a co-creator with God by helping to echo our guest voices, share our episodes with friends and family and on your own social media accounts. Give us positive 5-star reviews. The more positive reviews we have, the more visibility we have, and the more voices that are echoed through eternity. We often invite guests who are serving faithfully year after year, often in anonymity in their respective roles and ministries. God sees them, and the reality is for a good kingdom leader, that's enough. We do not do what we do for the accolades of humanity. We do it because we're called by God. But I believe that God uses people like you and I to continue those reverberations and echo them throughout eternity. You can partner with God by liking, subscribing, writing a quick positive 5-star review, and again, sharing those voices with friends and family and on your own social media accounts. Those reviews will eventually lead to other guests who have larger platforms that have more listeners, who will then in turn listen to the show. And again, it further echoes those voices, which is the whole vision of the Echoes Through Eternity podcast here, is to continue echoing those voices that God is echoing through eternity there. So like and subscribe and review us if you would. We'd appreciate that greatly.